Distinguished viewers, tomorrow morning in Quebec City, Mark Carney is not calling a cabinet meeting. He's issuing an ultimatum. After returning from his 9-day global tour, where he signed historic deals in Beijing and delivered a defiant speech at Davos declaring the end of America's world order, Carney walks into Quebec tomorrow with a message his ministers have never heard before. The 2-day cabinet planning forum, starting January 22nd, is being framed as routine, but those close to the Prime Minister know better. This is Carney activating war economy mode. The cost of living crisis, the housing emergency, the Trump tariff threats, they are not problems to be managed anymore. They are battles to be won, and Carney has run out of patience with bureaucratic delays. What happens behind closed doors at the Quebec retreat will determine whether Canada truly breaks free from decades of incrementalism, or whether the old guard drags Carney back into comfortable mediocrity. The stakes have never been higher. Let us examine what brought us to this inflection point. Mark Carney assumed office in March 2025 with a mandate that terrified the comfortable political class. He promised not to manage decline, but to architect Canada's resurgence. His first budget eliminated interprovincial trade barriers, cut taxes on business investment, and committed $1 trillion to infrastructure projects that bypass American approval entirely. But 9 months into his premiership, Carney is looking at polling data that reveals a harsh truth. Canadians overwhelmingly support his 7 priorities, with 89% demanding affordable housing and 70% placing cost of living as their top concern. Yet when asked if they see progress, the numbers collapse. The gap between expectation and perceived delivery is widening, and Carney knows exactly why. The machinery of government is still operating at Trudeau-era speed in a world that demands Carney-era velocity. Consider the timing of this Quebec retreat. Carney departed Canada on January 13th for what became a masterclass in strategic autonomy. In Beijing, he finalized the landmark trade agreement that slashes Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola from 84% to 15%, while securing market access for 49,000 electric vehicles annually. He met with President Xi Jinping and extracted commitments for considerable Chinese investment in Canada's EV supply chain within 3 years. Then he flew to Qatar, locking down investments in Canada's major infrastructure projects. Finally, at Davos, on January 20th, Carney delivered the speech that made global headlines. He declared the rules-based international order dead, called on middle powers to build strategic autonomy together, and positioned Canada as the nation that heard the wake-up call first. He told the assembled elites that nostalgia is not a strategy, and that Canada would no longer place the sign in the window pretending American hegemony works for everyone. Trump's threats over Greenland dominated Davos conversations, and Carney stood with Denmark while subtly reminding Washington that Article 5 commitments run both directions. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Carney returns to Canadian soil today, January 21st, and immediately convenes his cabinet tomorrow in Quebec City. The official statement mentions economy, affordability, and security. But read between the lines. This is not a planning session. This is Carney telling his ministers that the 9-day tour proved Canada can move fast when it chooses to, and now he expects that same velocity domestically. The cost of living file and the housing crisis are no longer acceptable as slow burn issues. What makes tomorrow's Quebec retreat fundamentally different from every cabinet meeting before it is Carney's stated intention to operate government like a mission-driven organization, not a bureaucracy managing competing interests. Let us examine the architecture of what he is building. The Cabinet Planning Forum runs January 22nd to 23rd, deliberately scheduled between Carney's return from the global stage and Parliament's resumption on Monday, January 26th. This is not accidental timing. Carney wants his ministers psychologically separated from the Ottawa bubble when he delivers his ultimatum. Quebec City provides geographic and psychological distance from the comfortable rituals of Parliament Hill. The agenda focuses on delivering change in the year ahead, and Cabinet will hear from experts in finance, community services, advanced technology, and global affairs. But here is what mainstream media will not tell you. Those expert briefings are designed to expose which ministers understand the urgency and which are still thinking in terms of 5-year implementation timelines. Carney released one unified mandate letter for his entire cabinet rather than individual assignments, signaling that every minister shares responsibility for the 7 core priorities. This breaks decades of siloed governance, where housing ministers blamed finance ministers, who blamed infrastructure ministers, in an endless cycle of buck passing. Now, when housing construction lags, every minister owns the failure. When cost of living remains stubbornly high, every minister must answer for it. Consider the political landscape Carney is navigating. His Liberal government sits 2 seats shy of a majority after 2 Conservative floor crossings last fall and Chrystia Freeland's departure earlier this month. He survived a confidence vote in November when the budget passed with Green Party support and NDP abstentions. This minority status should make him cautious, but Carney is doing the opposite. He is accelerating. Why? Because he understands that Canadians did not elect him to manage the status quo carefully. They elected him to break things that need breaking. The housing file exemplifies his approach. Carney's plan commits to doubling construction pace to nearly 500,000 new homes annually over the next decade. Build Canada Homes will provide $25 billion in financing to prefabricated home builders and $10 billion in low-cost financing for affordable housing. He is cutting municipal development charges in half and transferring all CMHC affordable housing programs to the new entity. This is not incremental policy. This is wartime mobilization applied to domestic infrastructure. But the plan only works if provincial and municipal governments move at the same speed. And here is where tomorrow becomes critical. Several cabinet ministers have been operating as if consultation and consensus building are virtues in themselves. Carney is about to tell them that consensus is worthless if it produces nothing. Quebec provides the perfect backdrop for this message because the province itself is in political flux following François Legault's resignation on January 14th. Legault, who led Quebec since 2018, stepped down after his coalition Avenir Quebec collapsed to 10% in polling, with 50% of Quebecers rating him very unfavorably. The Parti Québécois now leads polls by massive margins, and the October 5th provincial election will reshape federal-provincial dynamics entirely. Carney sees opportunity in this disruption. With Quebec's political establishment in transition, he can move faster on joint federal-provincial housing initiatives and infrastructure projects without getting bogged down in Legault-era turf wars. The retreat will address Trump's tariff threats, which have created both crisis and opportunity for Canada. Trump wants to break Canadian resolve so America can own Canada, as Carney himself said in recent statements. But the tariff threats have actually unified Canadian public opinion behind economic diversification and strategic autonomy. When Carney signed the China deal last week, some premiers objected. Ontario's Doug Ford called it giving China a foothold. Saskatchewan's Scott Moe, who joined Carney in Beijing, called it very good news. This split reveals the tension Carney faces in cabinet. Some ministers still believe Canada's destiny is tied inextricably to American approval. Others, like Carney, understand that Canada's leverage comes from having alternatives. Critics will argue that Carney is moving too fast, risking federal-provincial relations, and alienating moderate voters who prefer incremental change. They will point to Doug Ford's criticism of the China EV deal as evidence that Carney's aggressive trade diversification creates more problems than it solves. Let me address this directly with data. Canada's exports to China fell 10.4% last year to $41.7 billion because of tariff disputes. The canola industry, worth billions to prairie farmers, was effectively locked out of its second largest market. Carney's deal unlocks $3 billion in export orders for Canadian farmers, fish harvesters, and processors. The 49,000 Chinese EVs represent 3% of Canada's domestic market and will help bring affordable electric vehicles under $35,000 to Canadian consumers. Meanwhile, the deal promises considerable Chinese joint venture investment in Canada's EV manufacturing sector within 3 years. Those are not problems, those are solutions. The cruel irony that Trump supporters refuse to acknowledge is this. Trump's tariff threats were designed to force Canada into submission, but they have instead accelerated Canada's economic independence. Every trade deal Carney signs outside North America reduces American leverage. Every infrastructure project that bypasses US territory makes Canadian prosperity less dependent on White House moods. Trump wanted Canada desperate. He got Canada diversified. And the ministers who resist Carney's velocity are not protecting Canadian interests. They are protecting their own comfort zones while the world moves on without them. Tomorrow in Quebec City, Mark Carney will ask his cabinet a simple question. Do you want to be part of the transformation, or do you want to be replaced by someone who does? This is not a threat. This is a reality check. The infrastructure Carney is building, from LNG terminals to SMR facilities to CPKC rail corridors, will outlast any political career. The trade relationships he's forging with China, Qatar, and Germany and Europe will define Canadian prosperity for decades. The housing construction mobilization will either succeed spectacularly or fail publicly, and there is no middle ground. You are watching Canada shed 70 years of dependence on American goodwill and build something stronger, more resilient, and genuinely sovereign. The old guard can adapt or they can leave. Either way, the transformation is happening. Cabinet ministers who understand this will leave Quebec energized. Those who do not will leave Quebec looking for new jobs. Canada no longer needs to ask for permission.